My name is Ian Record. I direct the Partnership for Tribal Governance. And just briefly, the partnership was established several years ago at the request of tribal leaders, wanting NCAI to do a more forceful job, a more targeted and strategic job of supporting all of you as you work to lead in the governing of your nations. And so really what we're about is creating resources to help tribal leaders do their jobs better, to really think strategically about what does the exercise of sovereignty look like for our nations, and what does the exercise of sovereignty look like in my role as a leader, in my role as a department head, in my role as a community member, as a citizen of the nation. And so in that regard, we've been working over the past 3.5 years on a project that examines tribal workforce development, really looking at tribal innovation and workforce development. What's working, what's not, and why, as tribal nations work to build up their own people to help them reach their full inherent potential in order to rebuild tribal nations. That's fundamentally what this project is about. So this toolkit seeks to inform and support strategic decision-making by tribal decision-makers as tribes assess their workforce development approaches, figure out how to strengthen them, figure out how to make them truly their own, figure out how to make them truly tribal. So the Workforce Development Toolkit focuses on 15 strategic considerations, and basically how we arrived at these 15 is this was a very collaborative effort. We reached out, we engaged our networks of tribal nations, tribal leaders across the country, and got a better read on what are they doing when it comes to building their own capacity, building their human capacity to achieve the priorities for the future. And we really kept coming back to these 15 main themes, if you will, and I want to roll through them very quickly. First and foremost, tribal governance. What do I mean by that? It's tribal nations answering a question that I've heard posed by former Governor Regis Pecos of Coche de Pueblo many times, when he says, what are we doing differently in this time of self-determination when supposedly we are in control, different from the times that we weren't, that we were critical of? So really looking at this consideration of, do we really own our own workforce development approach? Or are we simply administering what the federal government has always done and just maybe slapping a new facade on it? So that's what the tribal governance one is all about. Strategic vision. How are your workforce development efforts tied into where you're trying to take the nation as a whole, right? Is there a connect there, or is there a disconnect there? Do you really know what you're doing now around workforce development? What kind of future is it trying to create for your people 25 years from now, 50 years from now? Integration. How many of you have heard the term silo approach, right? Silo approach, no one? I see a lot of nodding heads and laughing in the back, yes. So really, when you look at your workforce development, is it this sort of disconnected array of programs that are kind of strewn across tribal government? You might have some workforce development taking place in adult education. You might have some taking place in taro, et cetera, but they're not working together. They're not coordinating. They're not communicating. So that's really what that consideration focuses on. Institutions, governing institutions. Do you have the institutions in place to support effective strategic workforce development? Culture. Is your own culture reflected in, is it driving, is it perpetuating through your workforce development activities? How do you see culture in the work that you're doing to develop your human capacity? Leadership. And this consideration is not just about elected leadership, but programmatic leadership, right? What are the appropriate roles of your elected leadership, your political leadership, and what are the appropriate roles of your programmatic leadership? And how should the two of those work in unison in order to advance your workforce development efforts? Funding. This doesn't just focus on, the feds ought to be giving us more money for this program or that program. It's really focused on how can we be innovative by creating our own revenues and dedicating those revenues to our workforce development efforts to supplement what we get from the feds, what we get from the states, right? And then how can we work to defray costs in various areas by building partnerships, which is another key consideration that we looked at. Citizen engagement. Do your own people understand what workforce development services are available to them? Are those services provided to them in an efficient way? Or do they have to bounce around from one program, one office to the other all over the reservation in order to get the help that they need? Are you approaching workforce development through a person-centered approach? Or is it a program-focused approach? Assessment. Assessment's really about data. Do you have the information that you need, the data that you need to make informed decisions about how you want to develop your own people? Do you know where they're at right now? And do you know what it's going to take to get them to where you want to take them? Targeted solutions. This means that you don't approach all of your people with the same workforce development strategy, right? You've got to develop targeted approaches for your mid-career professionals, for your folks that may be 35, 40, 45 years old and they don't have a high school diploma or GED. How do you deal with them? How do you deal with your young people? How do you instill a work ethic in your young people at a young age? And this is where we really see a lot of our work moving as we continue our work on workforce development, because there's an extraordinary number of tribes that are doing really innovative things when it comes to developing workforce at a really young age, getting 10 and 12-year-olds into the professional environment and showing them what accountability looks like when you're working in a workplace, what working alongside other people, building teams looks like when you're working in a workplace. Removing obstacles. This toolkit takes a really hard look at all the various obstacles that tribal citizens face as they work to prepare to get a job, find a job, keep a job, grow in a job, build a career. And it really sort of isolates those and looks at different strategies that tribes are employing in that respect. Closing the loop. Closing the loop is really about how can tribes work to get a return on the investment that they're making in their own people, right? Whether that's through vocational training, higher education scholarship programs. I hear about this all the time, tribal leaders lamenting that, you know, we give our young people a scholarship to go off to school and then they never come back, right? So how are tribal nations working to bring their people back home or to keep them at home to begin with? Advancement. It's not just about getting your people a job, it's about how can you support them as they grow? How can you support them as they work to build a career? Partnerships. Some really cool work being done by tribes in this area. Tribes partnering with native CDFIs, with tribal colleges and universities to develop a distinctly tribal, distinctly local approach to workforce development that advances the tribe's own particular priorities when it comes to workforce development. And finally, sustainability. If you develop something that's working when it comes to workforce development, how do you expand that across all of your tribal government? And then how do you sustain that over time? So I have a few copies of the toolkit up here at the front, and just so you know, all of you are going to be receiving an email through our broadcast system later today with the link to the digital version of the toolkit. But I wanted to take you through what each of these considerations looks like. Basically, it's 15 two-page spreads that look like this. And on our online resource center, you're able to download each of these considerations individually and kind of isolate them and work on them. But each of these 15 contain 4 components. One is called framing the discussion. Framing the discussion is really sort of getting your mind around what are we talking about when we say citizen engagement? What are we talking about when we're talking about partnerships? And it sort of gives that sort of grand overview of the issue at hand. And then next we have questions to consider. So it's a half dozen or so questions that really get tribal decision makers to take a hard look at their own current workforce development approach and asking the fundamental question, is this really achieving what we want it to achieve? Where do we really need to focus our energy if we're going to be serious about strengthening our workforce development to achieve our long-term priorities? Then we have what we call innovation snapshots. For each consideration, 2 short summaries of what different tribes are doing. And I should acknowledge that this toolkit would not have been possible without the close working partnerships with 26 different tribal nations from across the country that are doing extraordinary things in this area. So 2 short summaries, and with each one of those summaries, we have what's called a learning link where you can go online and access related resources that give you more detail into the mechanics of how each tribe is approaching their workforce development challenges. And then what we call a connect link, where you can actually reach out to the person, the key player at that other tribe that's leading this effort and say, I want to learn more about what you're doing. And I'll give you a good example of this. So just a couple months ago, we were previewing this for a group of tribal leaders in Minneapolis, and somebody from the Coeur d'Alene tribe said, we're looking to get into expanding our workforce development approach to engage our tribal citizens who are coming out of the prison system and trying to help them get back on their feet. And we said, well, you need to talk to the Muskogee Creek Nation, because they have one of the best reentry programs, not just in Indian country, but in the entire country. And so that's what this toolkit is designed to do, is to connect tribes with one another and shorten that learning curve. And then finally, we have policy recommendations that really mirror the questions that we pose in each of these considerations. Some of the key policy recommendations that are really reflective of the strategies that we're seeing that tribes are employing that are working, and that can be replicated, not out of whole cloth, but replicated and customized to your own particular priorities. So as I mentioned, we have an online resource center to go with this toolkit, and you'll be receiving information about that later today, but we have more detail about what each tribe that we feature in the toolkit is doing. We also have the individual consideration PDFs, like I mentioned, and some other resources. And it's important to point out that this is an organic resource center. We're going to be growing this over time, and we are looking to you to keep us clued in on what you're doing. If you're doing something really innovative around workforce development, we want to know about it, and we want to share it with other tribes. And I want to mention, before I talk about some of the other resources that came out of this project, I think it's important to point out that this project would not have been possible without the generous support of the Northwest Area Foundation, who is an ardent advocate for tribal sovereignty and tribal governance. And they're doing some extraordinary work in the area of workforce development, in the area of private sector development in Indian country, financial capability in Indian country, and I applaud their commitment to tribal sovereignty and to tribal nations. Some of the other resources coming out of this project, we've also developed 4 in-depth case studies on tribal workforce development: Coeur d'Alene tribe, Salish and Kootenai tribes, the Gila River Indian community, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo. We got a policy brief that we're going to be working to update. This came out in late 2016, and given the fact that the new 477 law was passed last December, we're going to be working to update this brief and getting it back into your hands so you can advocate on this issue with federal policymakers. We have 23 videos on workforce development on our YouTube channel. We recommend you look at that. And then last but not least, we have 3 webinars on workforce development coming up, including one on middle of next month, basically a how-to webinar on the toolkit. So with that, I thank you. If you have any questions, I'm up here at the front, and I'd be happy to answer them for you. Thank you.